They underestimated him from the very beginning. The moment he walked through the doors of the company, people had already decided what kind of person he was. They didn't know his dreams, his struggles, or the sacrifices he had made to get there. They only saw an ordinary employee wearing simple clothes, carrying an old bag, and arriving at work without the confidence or attitude of the people around him. To them, that was enough. They assumed he wasn't ambitious. They assumed he wasn't intelligent enough to move higher. They assumed he would spend his entire career sitting at the same desk, following instructions from people who believed they were better than him. Nobody bothered to ask what he was capable of. During meetings, his ideas were often ignored. He would carefully explain a solution to a problem, only for someone more confident to repeat the same idea minutes later and receive all the attention. Sometimes people laughed when he spoke. Sometimes they interrupted him before he could finish. And sometimes they simply looked at him as if his opinion didn't matter. He noticed everything. He noticed the way certain employees changed their tone when speaking to senior managers. He noticed how people with expensive clothes and powerful connections were treated with respect before they had even proved themselves. He noticed how quickly people judged someone based on their position. But he never allowed their judgment to become his identity. There was one particular employee who enjoyed making him feel small. Whenever the team gathered for lunch, this coworker would make jokes about his old phone, his simple clothes, and the fact that he never seemed to spend money on expensive things. One afternoon, while several employees were sitting together, the coworker looked at him and laughed. "You really think you're going somewhere in this company?" The table became quiet for a moment. He looked at him calmly. The coworker continued, "People like you don't become executives. You should just be happy to have a job." A few people laughed. He could have responded. He could have defended himself. He could have explained how hard he had worked to get there. But he realized something important. People who have already decided that you are worthless rarely listen when you explain your value. So he said nothing. He simply finished his lunch and returned to his desk. That evening, while everyone else went home, he stayed behind. Not because he wanted revenge. Not because he wanted to make anyone feel guilty. He stayed because he had made a private decision. If people were going to underestimate him, he would stop trying to convince them otherwise. He would let his work speak. He began arriving earlier every morning. He studied reports that most employees ignored. He asked questions. He learned how the company's departments worked. He studied sales numbers, customer behavior, marketing strategies, financial reports, and management decisions. He didn't only want to be good at his job. He wanted to understand the entire business. When his coworkers were discussing weekend plans, he was sometimes reading about leadership. When others complained about management, he tried to understand why certain decisions had been made. When others saw problems, he started looking for solutions. Slowly, something changed. His confidence grew. His knowledge grew. His ability to solve difficult problems became stronger. But his personality didn't change. He remained quiet. He didn't announce his plans. He didn't tell everyone that he would become successful one day. He didn't post motivational quotes online or constantly talk about his ambitions. He simply kept working. And because he wasn't making noise about his progress, most people didn't notice it. That was their mistake. They were watching his position. He was building his potential. They were judging his present. He was preparing for his future. Months turned into years, and the same people continued to see him as the quiet employee in the corner. They didn't realize that every difficult assignment was teaching him something. Every rejection was making him more patient. Every insult was teaching him not to depend on other people's approval. Every mistake was making him smarter. And every time someone underestimated him, he became even more determined to improve. One day, a major project was assigned to the department. Several experienced employees struggled to find a solution. Meetings continued for days. Arguments broke out. Managers disagreed about what should be done. He quietly studied the problem. Then he developed a detailed plan. At first, nobody took him seriously, but when the manager finally reviewed his proposal, the room became quiet. His plan wasn't perfect, but it was practical. It addressed problems nobody else had noticed. For the first time, senior management began paying attention to him. The same person everyone considered insignificant had just solved a problem that experienced employees couldn't solve. And that was only the beginning. His work began speaking louder than his reputation. People started asking him for advice. Managers started including him in important discussions. Executives started noticing his ability to remain calm under pressure. Yet the people who had mocked him still didn't fully understand what was happening. They had spent so much time believing he was a nobody that they couldn't recognize the person he was becoming right in front of them. He wasn't suddenly becoming talented. The talent had been there all along. They simply had never bothered to look closely enough. He never fought back against the people who underestimated him. Instead, he decided that the best response was to work harder than they expected. After everything that had happened, he could have spent his days trying to prove people wrong. He could have argued with the coworker who mocked him, complained to management about the disrespect, or constantly reminded everyone that he was capable of more than they believed. But he understood that arguing would only keep him trapped in the same situation. Every time someone insulted him, he asked himself a different question. What can I learn from this? That question changed the way he approached his entire career. He stopped looking for recognition and started looking for knowledge. If there was a difficult assignment, he volunteered to learn it. If someone was working on a complicated project, he watched carefully. If management made a decision he didn't understand, he studied the reasons behind it. He began treating the workplace like a classroom. Every department became an opportunity to learn something new. He learned about sales by studying how successful employees communicated with customers. He learned about finance by examining company reports and understanding where money was being made and where it was being lost. He learned about marketing by studying why certain campaigns succeeded while others failed. He learned about leadership by observing both good managers and bad managers. The good managers taught him what to do. The bad managers taught him what never to become. He didn't realize it at first, but every difficult day was adding another piece to the person he would eventually become. His coworkers still saw an employee. He was building himself into a leader. There were nights when he went home exhausted. His body wanted rest, but his mind kept thinking about everything he still needed to learn. Sometimes he wondered whether all the extra effort was worth it. Nobody was applauding him. Nobody was promising him a promotion. Nobody was telling him that his hard work would eventually pay off. There was no guarantee. But he continued, because he had finally understood that personal growth doesn't always come with immediate rewards. Sometimes you work for months without seeing results. Sometimes you improve while nobody notices. Sometimes you become stronger in silence. And sometimes the biggest changes in your life happen before anyone else realizes that you have changed. He began creating a routine. He would arrive at work before most of his coworkers. Instead of immediately checking his phone or talking about office gossip, he would review his tasks and study what needed to be done. During breaks, he would read articles related to business and leadership. After work, he continued learning. He watched educational videos. He studied successful companies. He learned how executives made decisions. He practiced communication. He worked on his confidence. He even started improving the way he handled criticism. Before, a negative comment could stay in his mind for hours. Now, he listened carefully. If the criticism was useful, he learned from it. If it was simply an insult, he ignored it. That distinction gave him freedom. He no longer needed everyone to like him. He only needed to keep improving. One afternoon, the same coworker who had mocked him approached his desk. There was a problem with a report, and the coworker couldn't figure out how to correct it. For a moment, he remembered all the times that person had laughed at him. He could have ignored him. He could have said, "You told me people like me would never succeed. Figure it out yourself." But he didn't. He helped him. Not because he had forgotten the disrespect, but because he refused to allow someone else's behavior to determine his own character. He explained the problem and showed him how to fix it. The coworker looked surprised. "You actually knew how to solve this." He simply nodded. There was no need to brag. No need to remind him of the past. No need to say, "I told you so." He returned to his work. That moment taught him something important about discipline. Real confidence doesn't need to announce itself. A person who is truly focused on growth doesn't need to win every argument. He doesn't need to respond to every insult. He doesn't need to prove his intelligence every time someone questions him. Sometimes the strongest response is simply continuing to improve. As the months passed, his knowledge became impossible to ignore. He started solving problems faster. He began noticing mistakes before they became serious. When meetings became complicated, he could explain difficult situations in simple language. When customers became angry, he knew how to calm them. When employees disagreed, he could listen to both sides and find a practical solution. He was becoming valuable. And value is difficult to hide forever. One of the senior managers eventually noticed that he was always prepared. Whenever a question came up, he usually had an answer. Whenever the company faced a problem, he was willing to investigate it. Whenever someone needed help, he didn't immediately complain about the extra work. He simply handled it. The manager asked him one day why he worked so hard when nobody had promised him a promotion. He smiled and said, "I'm not only working for the position I have, I'm preparing for the position I want." That answer stayed with the manager, because it revealed something most people never understood. He wasn't working harder because he was desperate for approval. He was working harder because he knew that opportunity often arrives before people are ready for it. He wanted to be ready. So while his coworkers focused on getting through each day, he focused on becoming capable of handling a much bigger responsibility. He started thinking beyond his job description. Instead of asking, "What am I supposed to do?" he began asking, "What needs to be done?" That small change completely transformed his approach. If he saw a customer problem outside his responsibility, he tried to help. If he noticed an inefficient process, he suggested an improvement. If another employee struggled, he shared what he had learned. He wasn't trying to become everyone's favorite employee. He was developing the habits of someone who could eventually lead people. And the more he learned, the more he realized how much he still didn't know. That realization didn't discourage him. It motivated him. He understood that success wasn't about becoming the smartest person in the room. It was about becoming someone who was willing to keep learning when everyone else thought they already knew enough. Years earlier, people had called him a nobody because they couldn't see his potential. Now, slowly and quietly, he was turning that potential into something real. His transformation wasn't happening overnight. There was no sudden miracle. There was no lucky shortcut. It was happening through thousands of small decisions that nobody was watching. Getting up early, studying after work, accepting criticism, learning from mistakes, staying calm under pressure, helping others, taking responsibility, showing up when he was tired, and continuing even when nobody believed in him. Every single day, he was becoming more prepared for an opportunity that had not arrived yet. And he had no idea how soon that opportunity would come. The humiliation he experienced slowly became a source of motivation. At first, every insult hurt. He remembered the laughter when he spoke during meetings. He remembered the coworker who told him that people like him would never become successful. He remembered the looks he received whenever he walked into a room filled with people who had better clothes, better connections, and more confidence than he did. There were moments when he went home and questioned himself. Maybe they were right. Maybe he really wasn't good enough. Maybe he had been foolish to believe that he could ever rise above his position. Those thoughts were difficult to escape because they didn't come from strangers on the street. They came from people he saw almost every day. When someone repeatedly tells you that you are not capable, their words can become difficult to separate from your own thoughts. But one evening, while sitting alone at his small desk at home, he realized something. If he allowed their opinions to control him, they would win without having to do anything else. They wouldn't need to stop his career. They wouldn't need to take away an opportunity. They wouldn't need to defeat him directly. All they had to do was convince him that he couldn't succeed. That realization changed something inside him. He decided that he would no longer use their words as a reason to feel weak. He would use them as a reminder to become stronger. The next morning, he arrived at work with a different mindset. He still heard the jokes. He still noticed the dismissive looks. He still knew that some people didn't respect him. But instead of thinking, "Why don't they believe in me?" he started thinking, "What do I need to do to become undeniable?" That question became his motivation. He didn't suddenly become angry or aggressive. He became disciplined. Whenever someone underestimated him, he worked on himself. Whenever someone said he wasn't experienced enough, he gained more experience. Whenever someone criticized his communication, he practiced speaking. Whenever someone said he didn't understand leadership, He studied leadership. Whenever someone laughed at his lack of confidence, he worked on becoming more comfortable with himself. He stopped trying to silence his critics. He started building a version of himself that their opinions could no longer define. There was a difference between anger and motivation. Anger wanted immediate revenge. Motivation was willing to wait. Anger wanted to see the other person suffer. Motivation wanted to see himself grow. He chose motivation. That decision saved him from becoming bitter. He could have started treating everyone badly because people had treated him badly. Instead, he promised himself that if he ever reached a position of authority, he would remember exactly what it felt like to be ignored. He would remember what it felt like to sit quietly in a meeting while people talked over him. He would remember what it felt like to have an idea dismissed because of his position. He would remember what it felt like to walk into a room and feel invisible. Those memories became part of his education. They taught him empathy. They taught him patience. They taught him the importance of giving people an opportunity before judging them. But they also taught him something else. Never confuse someone's current position with their potential. A person sitting at the lowest level of a company could eventually become its most valuable leader. A person struggling today could build something extraordinary tomorrow. A person who appears ordinary could be carrying an ambition that nobody can see. He began to understand that success often starts long before anyone can recognize it. There were no headlines about his progress. No one was celebrating his late nights. No one knew how many times he had stayed awake studying after everyone else had gone to sleep. No one knew how many mistakes he had made while learning. No one knew how often he had considered giving up and then decided to continue. His progress was invisible. But invisible progress is still progress. One of the hardest moments came when he applied for an internal promotion. He had spent months preparing. He believed he was ready. He submitted his application and waited. When the decision was announced, someone else received the position. The person selected had less experience with the company's operations, but they had stronger relationships with senior employees. He was disappointed. For a few hours, the old feeling returned. That feeling of being overlooked. That feeling of being told without words that he wasn't important enough. But instead of quitting, he asked for feedback. The manager explained that his technical skills were strong, but he needed to develop his leadership and communication abilities. It wasn't the answer he wanted, but it was the answer he needed. He wrote everything down. Then he went back to work. He didn't complain about the person who received the promotion. He didn't spread rumors. He didn't tell everyone that the company had made a terrible mistake. He took the criticism seriously. Over the next year, he worked specifically on the areas where he was weak. He volunteered to lead small projects. He started speaking more during meetings. He learned how to present ideas clearly. He learned how to handle disagreements without becoming emotional. He learned how to give feedback without insulting people. He learned how to take responsibility when something went wrong. The rejection that once felt like humiliation became one of his most valuable lessons. That was the pattern of his life. Every setback became information. Every insult became motivation. Every rejection became an opportunity to identify what he needed to improve. He didn't become successful because people were kind to him. He became stronger because difficult experiences forced him to develop qualities he might never have developed otherwise. The same people who once laughed at him began noticing the change. He was still quiet, but his quietness no longer looked like weakness. He was still simple in appearance, but his confidence was different. When he spoke, people listened. When he presented an idea, people considered it. When a problem appeared, people began asking for his opinion. His transformation was happening slowly enough that nobody could identify the exact moment it occurred. There wasn't one dramatic day when he suddenly became a different person. It happened through repetition. One decision after another. One lesson after another. One difficult day after another. And eventually, the person who had once been desperate for recognition no longer needed it. He had developed something more valuable than approval. He had developed belief in himself. That belief didn't mean he thought he was better than everyone else. It meant he finally understood that someone else's judgment couldn't determine his future. He no longer needed the coworker who mocked him to apologize. He no longer needed the people who ignored him to admit they were wrong. He didn't need their permission to become successful. His motivation had changed. In the beginning, He wanted to prove them wrong. Later, he wanted to prove himself right. There was a huge difference. When your goal is to prove someone else wrong, your happiness depends on their reaction. But when your goal is to become better than you were yesterday, your progress belongs entirely to you. That was the mindset he carried into every challenge. He stopped asking whether people believed in him. He started asking whether he was doing everything possible to become the person he wanted to be. And whenever the answer was no, he went back to work. His preparation was so quiet that most people didn't realize anything was changing. From the outside, it looked like he was still the same employee. He arrived at the same building every morning. He sat at the same desk. He attended the same meetings. He answered the same emails. He followed the same routine. Nothing about his daily life suggested that he was preparing for something much bigger. But beneath that ordinary routine, he was developing skills that would eventually change his entire position inside the company. He understood that opportunities rarely announce themselves months in advance. Most people wait until an opportunity appears before they start preparing for it. He wanted to do the opposite. He wanted to be ready before anyone gave him a chance. So he began studying the company, as if one day he would be responsible for running it. He learned how different departments worked together. He studied the sales department and tried to understand why certain products performed better than others. He paid attention to customer complaints because he realized that complaints often revealed problems that management couldn't see from a spreadsheet. He studied the financial side of the business. He learned where the company was spending too much money. He learned which projects produced results and which projects consumed resources without creating enough value. He started asking questions that most employees never thought to ask. Why was this process so slow? Why were customers leaving? Why did employees keep making the same mistake? Why was one department constantly waiting for another? Why were certain decisions taking weeks when they could be made in days? He wasn't officially responsible for solving those problems, but he wanted to understand them. Every answer made him more knowledgeable. Every problem taught him something about leadership. He also began paying close attention to the people who were already successful. He watched how senior executives behaved during difficult situations. He noticed that the strongest leaders rarely panicked. When something went wrong, they didn't immediately start blaming people. They asked questions. What happened? Why did it happen? What can we do now? How can we prevent it from happening again? He noticed another important difference. Weak leaders wanted to look intelligent. Strong leaders wanted the team to succeed. That observation changed the way he thought about leadership. He didn't want a title just because a title sounded impressive. He wanted the ability to handle responsibility. He wanted people to trust his decisions. He wanted to become the kind of leader who could walk into a difficult situation and make it better instead of making it worse. So he practiced. Whenever he was given a small responsibility, he treated it seriously. If he was asked to organize a project, he created a clear plan. If he was asked to help a new employee, he made sure the person understood the process. If something went wrong, he didn't immediately look for someone to blame. He looked for the cause. Slowly, his reputation began changing. Not dramatically, not publicly, but quietly. People began saying things like, "Ask him. He probably knows how to fix it." That sentence meant more to him than any compliment, because it showed that people were beginning to trust his ability. He had gone from being ignored to becoming someone others depended on. Yet he still didn't tell anyone about his ambitions. He had learned that talking about a goal can sometimes create the feeling of progress without the actual work. He didn't want the feeling. He wanted the result. There were times when his friends asked why he was working so hard. They couldn't understand why he spent so much time learning things that weren't technically required for his position. He simply told them that he wanted to grow. They didn't know how serious he was. They didn't know that he was preparing for responsibilities he didn't even have yet. He was building knowledge before he needed it. He was developing confidence before he was given authority. He was learning how to lead before anyone called him a leader. That preparation eventually began producing visible results. A major client once threatened to leave the company because of repeated service problems. Senior managers were discussing the issue, but nobody could identify the exact reason the relationship had deteriorated. He had been following the situation for months. He had noticed a pattern. The problem wasn't one employee. It wasn't one mistake. It was a communication failure between several departments. Information was being lost between the sales team, operations, and customer service. He explained the pattern to his manager and suggested a new process. The manager initially hesitated, but the numbers supported his idea. They implemented the change. Within weeks, customer complaints decreased. The client stayed. For the first time, senior management understood that his value wasn't limited to completing assigned tasks. He could see the bigger picture. That was one of the most important differences between an ordinary employee and a future leader. An ordinary employee often asks, "What is my responsibility?" A leader asks, "What is the responsibility of the entire team?" He had begun thinking like the second person. The people who had called him a nobody still didn't understand what they were witnessing. They assumed his success was temporary. They believed management was simply giving him more work. They didn't realize that every new responsibility was giving him experience. Every difficult project was strengthening his decision-making. Every meeting with senior management was teaching him how executives thought. Every conversation with customers was improving his communication. He was collecting experience that would eventually become more valuable than any certificate. Then came another opportunity. The company needed someone to lead a small team during an important project. Several employees wanted the position. He didn't ask for it. Instead, his manager recommended him. The people in the office were surprised. Some questioned the decision. The same coworker who had once laughed at him even made a sarcastic comment. Since when did he become a leader? He heard it. But he didn't react. He accepted the responsibility. The project was difficult. 2 members of the team disagreed constantly. Another employee missed deadlines. A client changed requirements halfway through the project. There were days when everything seemed to go wrong. But instead of becoming angry, he remained calm. He listened to everyone. He divided responsibilities clearly. He dealt with problems one at a time. When someone made a mistake, he corrected the mistake without humiliating the person. When someone performed well, he gave them credit. The project was completed successfully. For him, that experience was more important than the recognition that followed. He had learned that leadership wasn't about telling people what to do. It was about helping people perform at their best. His preparation was beginning to make sense. The things he had studied when nobody was watching were becoming useful. The skills he had developed when nobody cared were now helping other people. And the confidence he had built privately was becoming visible publicly. Still, he remained careful. He didn't become arrogant. He didn't start treating people differently because he had received more attention. In fact, he became even more respectful toward employees at the lower levels of the company. He knew exactly how it felt to be ignored. He knew what it felt like when someone looked at your job title and decided your opinion didn't matter. So whenever a junior employee had an idea, he listened. Sometimes the idea was wrong. Sometimes it was useful. But he always listened. That habit eventually became one of the reasons people trusted him. They knew he wasn't interested only in hearing from people with impressive titles. He cared about information. He understood that a person at the bottom of an organization might see a problem that executives never notice. The years of quiet preparation had changed the way he viewed success. He no longer saw success as a distant dream. He saw it as the result of becoming capable enough to handle bigger responsibilities. And every day, he was becoming more capable. He had no idea that the company was heading toward a major leadership crisis. He didn't know that senior executives were about to make decisions that would change the future of the business. He didn't know that the owners were beginning to search for someone who understood the company from the inside out. He only knew that he needed to keep preparing. So he continued learning, continued working, continued observing, continued taking responsibility. While everyone else was watching his current position, he was quietly preparing for a future position that nobody around him could yet imagine. The moment everything changed came without warning. For years, he had been the employee people barely noticed. He had watched managers come and go. He had seen talented employees leave because they felt unappreciated. He had witnessed executives make decisions that helped the company and others that nearly damaged it. Through all of it, he kept learning. He never imagined that one day the entire organization would depend on someone like him. Then the company entered a difficult period. Sales began falling. Several important clients started moving their business to competitors. Operating costs increased. Departments began blaming one another. Senior managers held meeting after meeting, trying to determine what had gone wrong. The atmosphere inside the company changed. People who had once walked confidently through the office were suddenly worried about their jobs. Rumors spread through the building. Some employees believed the company would be sold. Others believed entire departments would be eliminated. Nobody knew what was going to happen. The executives tried to reassure everyone, but behind closed doors, they were facing serious problems. The company's leadership had become disconnected from what was actually happening on the ground. They had reports. They had statistics. They had financial projections. But they weren't hearing enough from the employees who dealt with customers every day. They weren't listening closely enough to the people who understood the company's daily operations. He had been watching these problems for years. He knew where the communication gaps were. He knew which processes were wasting time. He knew why certain customers were becoming frustrated. He understood the employees because he had worked alongside them. He understood management because he had spent years studying how decisions were made. He understood customers because he had personally dealt with them. For the first time, the skills he had quietly developed were needed on a much larger scale. The company's owners eventually made a difficult decision. Several senior executives were removed from their positions. A new leadership structure was going to be created. The announcement was scheduled for Monday morning. Nobody knew who the new leader would be. Employees gathered in the main conference room. Some were nervous. Some were curious. Others were already speculating about which executive would take control. The same coworker who had once mocked him was sitting near the front. He was talking confidently with other employees, making predictions about the company's future. He had no idea that his own world was about to change. The room became quiet when the company owner entered. Everyone stood. The owner looked around the room and thanked everyone for their patience during the difficult period. Then he announced that the company had appointed a new chief executive. People began whispering. They expected a well-known business executive from outside the company. Someone with an impressive resume. Someone who had managed large organizations before. The owner paused. Then he turned toward the conference room doors. The doors opened. He walked in. For several seconds, nobody moved. The room was completely silent. The man they had called a nobody was standing at the front of the room. He wasn't wearing expensive designer clothes. He wasn't trying to look powerful. He simply walked calmly to the seat reserved for the company's new leader. Some employees looked at each other in disbelief. Others lowered their eyes. A few people appeared embarrassed. The coworker who had once mocked him looked frozen. He remembered every joke, every insult. Every time he had told him that people like him would never become successful. Now that same person was sitting in a position of authority over him. The irony was impossible to ignore. The man who had once been told to be grateful for simply having a job was now responsible for deciding the future of the company. But what happened next surprised everyone. He didn't smile arrogantly. He didn't mention the insults. He didn't point toward the people who had mocked him. He didn't use his new position to embarrass anyone. He simply began speaking about the company. He talked about the problems. He talked about the customers. He talked about the employees. He talked about the future. He explained that the company had made mistakes, but mistakes could be corrected. He said that the organization needed better communication, stronger accountability, and a culture where employees could speak honestly about problems. People listened. Not because they were afraid of him, because he knew what he was talking about. He wasn't sitting there because someone had given him a lucky opportunity. He had spent years preparing for that moment. He knew the company's operations. He knew its weaknesses. He knew its strengths. He knew the people. He knew the customers. He understood the business from the ground up. That knowledge immediately became obvious. During the first leadership meeting, one senior manager presented a plan for reducing costs. It looked impressive on paper, but he asked several questions. What would happen to customer service? How would the changes affect delivery times? Which departments would absorb the additional workload? What would happen if customer complaints increased? The manager struggled to answer. He had already considered those questions. Because he had worked at the operational level, he understood the consequences that executives sometimes missed. He didn't reject the plan, he improved it. That became his leadership style. He wasn't interested in proving that he was smarter than everyone else. He wanted better decisions. Within the first few weeks, he began meeting employees from every department. He spoke with warehouse workers. He spoke with customer service representatives. He spoke with salespeople. He spoke with administrative staff. He asked simple questions. What is slowing you down? What do customers complain about most? What is one process you would change? What does management misunderstand about your work? People were initially nervous. They didn't know whether they could speak honestly to the new CEO. But he listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't dismiss their concerns. He took notes. Some employees brought up problems that had existed for years. Problems previous managers had ignored. He started fixing them. Not all at once, but systematically. One department had a reporting system that created unnecessary paperwork. He simplified it. Another department was constantly waiting for approval from management. He changed the approval process. Customer service employees were struggling with outdated information. He improved the internal communication system. Small changes began producing larger results. Employees became more efficient. Customers noticed improvements. Managers had better information. The company slowly began recovering. And something else happened. The people who had once treated him as insignificant started changing their behavior. They became more respectful. Some suddenly wanted to be close to him. Some began complimenting his leadership. Some acted as if they had always supported him. He noticed, but he didn't let it change him. He remembered the difference between genuine respect and respect created by authority. He didn't need people to pretend they had believed in him all along. He simply wanted the company to succeed. One afternoon, the coworker who had mocked him years earlier requested a private meeting. He entered the office nervously. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The coworker finally apologized. He admitted that he had judged him unfairly. He said he regretted the things he had said. The new CEO listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't laugh. He didn't remind him of every insult. When the apology was finished, he simply said that everyone makes mistakes and that what mattered now was how they worked together moving forward. The coworker looked surprised. He had expected anger. He had expected revenge. Instead, he received professionalism. That response said more about the man's transformation than any speech could have. He had gained authority without losing his character. And that was becoming clear throughout the organization. People started seeing him differently. Not simply as the new boss. As someone who had earned the position through years of preparation. Someone who understood what it meant to start at the bottom. Someone who knew how easily people could be overlooked. Someone who understood that leadership wasn't about making others feel small. It was about creating an environment where people could become better. His office was now larger. His responsibilities were much greater. His decisions affected hundreds of employees. But the person sitting behind the desk was still the same man who had once worked quietly in the corner. The difference was that now everyone could finally see what had been there all along. His greatest revenge was not making the people who had humiliated him suffer. It was becoming successful without allowing their cruelty to change the person he was. For years, he had imagined what it would feel like to stand above the people who had laughed at him. There were moments when he wanted to imagine their faces, when they finally realized they had been wrong. But when that moment actually arrived, he discovered something unexpected. The satisfaction wasn't in watching them feel embarrassed. It was in knowing that he had built his success through his own effort. He hadn't cheated anyone. He hadn't destroyed anyone's career. He hadn't manipulated the company. He hadn't waited for someone to fail so he could take their place. He had simply become better. That made his success more meaningful. The people who once called him a nobody had judged him by what they could see. They saw his position. They saw his clothes. They saw his quiet personality. They saw his lack of connections. But they never saw the hours he spent learning. They never saw the nights he spent preparing. They never saw the mistakes he made and corrected. They never saw how many times he questioned himself and continued anyway. They only saw the beginning of his story and assumed they knew how it would end. Now they were forced to look at the result. And the result was impossible to ignore. He was sitting in the position they had once believed was impossible for him to reach. But instead of using his authority to punish everyone who had mistreated him, he decided to build something better. He understood that revenge could be temporary. Success could last much longer. If he spent his time humiliating the people who had humiliated him, he would remain emotionally connected to the same people he had spent years trying to move beyond. He didn't want that. He wanted freedom. So he focused on the company. He focused on improving the culture. He focused on rewarding hard work. He focused on giving talented employees opportunities. He made one rule very clear. No employee would be judged solely by their background, appearance, social status, or current position. People would be judged by their character, performance, willingness to learn, and ability to contribute. That rule came directly from his own experience. He knew how painful it was to be dismissed before being given a chance. So he made sure others received the chance he once wanted. One of his first major decisions involved an employee who had been overlooked for years. The employee was talented but quiet. Managers rarely noticed him because he didn't speak loudly during meetings. Instead of judging him by his personality, the new CEO looked at his work. He discovered that the employee had been solving complex problems for years without receiving recognition. He promoted him to a position where his skills could be used more effectively. That decision sent a message throughout the company. Talent could no longer hide simply because someone wasn't good at advertising themselves. The organization began changing. Employees became more willing to share ideas. Managers became more careful about how they treated their teams. People started realizing that leadership was watching not only the results but also the way those results were achieved. The new CEO didn't demand perfection. He demanded responsibility. If someone made a mistake and admitted it, he focused on fixing the problem. If someone repeatedly made the same mistake and refused to take responsibility, he addressed it directly. He wasn't interested in creating a culture of fear. He wanted a culture of accountability. That distinction mattered, because fear can make people follow instructions. Trust can make people give their best. And he understood the difference because he had experienced both sides. As the company recovered, his reputation grew beyond the organization. Business publications began mentioning the company's turnaround. Industry leaders wanted to meet him. Investors became interested. Employees began telling stories about the CEO who had started at the bottom and eventually taken control of the company. But even with the attention, he remained grounded. He continued visiting different departments. He continued asking employees questions. He continued learning. He knew that success could become dangerous if it made someone stop listening. The same humility that had helped him survive difficult years now helped him lead. One day, during a company event, an employee asked him how he had managed to rise so far despite being underestimated. The room became quiet. Everyone expected an impressive answer. Instead, he said that there had never been one special moment. There had only been thousands of small moments. Moments when he could have quit but continued. Moments when he could have become bitter but chose to learn. Moments when he could have argued but chose to work. Moments when he could have blamed others but chose to take responsibility for himself. That answer stayed with many people, because it revealed that his success wasn't created by one dramatic act of revenge. It was created through consistency. He had built his future while everyone else was busy judging his present, and that was perhaps the most powerful part of his story. The people who had underestimated him had expected him to react emotionally. They expected anger. They expected bitterness. They expected him to become cruel once he gained power. Instead, he became more disciplined, more thoughtful, more patient, more focused. He didn't forget what had happened. But remembering the past didn't mean living inside it. He used his past as a lesson, not as a weapon. There was a time when being called a nobody would have destroyed his confidence. Now, those words had almost no power over him. He knew who he was. He knew what he had built. He knew how much work had gone into becoming the person sitting in that office. No insult could erase that. No criticism could take it away. And no apology was necessary for him to feel successful. His success belonged to him. The same coworker who once told him that people like him would never rise eventually became one of the employees who benefited from his leadership. That irony wasn't lost on him. But he didn't use it as an opportunity to humiliate the man. He treated him fairly. If the coworker performed well, he was recognized. If he made a mistake, he was corrected. If he contributed something valuable, he received credit. Nothing more. Nothing less. That was his idea of justice, not revenge for the sake of revenge. Fairness. He believed that becoming powerful didn't give him permission to become cruel. In fact, he believed the opposite. The more authority someone has, the more responsibility they have to control themselves. He had spent years learning how painful it was when someone powerful used their position to make another person feel worthless. He refused to repeat that cycle. His story began changing the people around him. Employees who once lacked confidence began taking opportunities. Junior workers started speaking during meetings. People began mentoring one another. Managers started recognizing talent they had previously ignored. The company wasn't perfect. No organization ever is. But the culture was different, and that difference came from someone who understood what it felt like to be invisible. His journey also changed the way his former critics saw success. Some realized that they had been measuring people incorrectly. They had assumed wealth meant intelligence. They had assumed confidence meant competence. They had assumed a powerful position meant someone deserved respect. But his story showed them something different. Respect can be earned quietly. Competence can develop without an audience. Ambition doesn't always look impressive at the beginning. Sometimes the person sitting silently in the corner is the person preparing most seriously for the future. His rise became a reminder to everyone around him that today's position is not necessarily tomorrow's destination. The employee they ignore today could become the leader they depend on tomorrow. The person they laugh at today could become the person who changes the entire organization. The person they consider ordinary could be carrying extraordinary potential. And that was the lesson his success communicated without him having to say it. He didn't need to stand in front of the people who had insulted him and announce that he had won. His life had already answered them. His work had answered them. His leadership had answered them. His transformation had answered them. The greatest revenge wasn't making them regret their words. It was reaching a level where their words no longer mattered. He had once worked desperately to prove that he wasn't a nobody. Now he understood that he had never been one. He had simply been surrounded by people who couldn't recognize his value. And while they were busy deciding what he could never become, he was quietly becoming it. Years later, people still remembered the man who had once been called a nobody. But they no longer remembered him because of the insults he had received. They remembered him because of what he became. He had walked into that company with nothing but determination, patience, and a belief that his future could be different from his present. People judged him by what they saw. He judged himself by what he could become. And that difference changed his life. He never needed to destroy the people who had laughed at him. He never needed to make them suffer. He simply kept moving forward until their opinions became irrelevant. His story proved that sometimes the strongest revenge isn't revenge at all. It's growth. It's discipline. It's success. It's becoming the person everyone said you could never be. So if someone is underestimating you today, remember his story. Don't waste your energy trying to convince them. Don't let their words become your limits. Keep learning, keep working, keep improving, because the person they call a nobody today may become the person they have no choice but to respect tomorrow. And when that day comes, let your success speak for you. They called him a nobody, until one day they had to call him their boss.